Hi everybody, Dr. Pingle here with today's lecture on data sources. So this is going to be a fairly short lecture, but a fairly important one. And I'd encourage you to we're going to talk about a lot of these different sources, and I'm going to make short videos that go into each of these in turn, sort of showing the practical aspects of it, how you get the data, what you might do with it, things like that. So this lecture is the overview, so we'll tick through these fairly quickly. What I wanted to do first was talk a little bit about why we're doing this. And so there's a nice article that came out very recently in Directions Mag with a nice article by Diana Sinton. What she said was that it's fairly easy to plan an introduction to GIS class where you have what we would call canned data, where we provide the data for you, and you kind of operate on that and then turn something in. This is very necessary, typically early on. But what we want to do is we want to prepare you for the workforce where you're certainly not going to be getting canned data handed to you. So this course is partly about bridging that gap between sort of learning how to operate on data that you're given, to going out there and finding your own data, creating your own data. So in this, sort of the nutshell of this quote here is at the bottom. Give someone a folder of data, they can make one map, give them the skills to find and fix their own data, and they can become mappers, and that's what we're trying to do here. GIS has come a long way in the last few years, the last decade. When I started doing GIS, it was pretty typical that you loaded up a blank map, or you started it up and there was really nothing available. Every piece of data that you wanted to use, you had to have or find. And these days, there are some nice alternatives to that. So Google Earth and Google Maps, as well as a number of other virtual globes, sort of provide a way for most people to sort of get started without all that buy-in, right? If you want to start mapping, it's pretty easy to go to My Maps or to use Google Earth and start making some things on your own. ArcGIS is still a little bit different. In fact, most GISs are a little bit different. And so when you start up the program, you're still greeted with this kind of blank screen, and it's your job to sort of figure out how to fill that in. One of the nice new additions, relatively recent additions to the ArcGIS package is the ability to connect to ArcGIS online and pulling in base maps. So we've got a couple of different things when you go to your Add Data button within ArcGIS, and Add Data is where you'd load your shapefiles, your geodatabases, or your rasters, or whatever. Add base map is what we're talking about here, and when you click on that, you'll get this dialog box that comes up. And maybe you haven't spent a lot of time taking a look and seeing what's available, but there are really some nice layers. So we've got imagery and imagery with layers, and these are more or less correspond to what you would see on different versions of Google Maps or something. We've got a nice topographic layer that includes some very good shading of the area. We've got a couple of really nice base maps here, the dark gray canvas and the light gray canvas, that are really useful when you want to bring out a lot of thematic detail. The National Geographic layer, a digital version of the National Geographic Society layers. A nice oceans layer if you're mapping things in the water. Terrain with labels, so a little bit different, a little bit more oriented, showing you sort of the shapes and textures of the terrain. Whereas this is sort of a more typical topographic map. We've got the OpenStreetMap layer. We're going to be talking about that in some detail. So I'll be talking about it as a data source, and then we'll have a separate lecture actually on OpenStreetMap specifically. And then we've got another version of the USA Topo Maps and the USGS National Map. So lots of good options here, and I would encourage you to open each one of those up in turn. All of those are going to bring down layers from the cloud, so they can take a little bit of time to tile in, but they do what's called cache. So once they come in, they stay in for a certain length of time, up to a certain amount of space. So it's not always as bad as the first time that you load it. So that said, you've got some nice data layers that are available to you right when you start ArcGIS, and that's very nice. But almost always that's not going to be enough to sort of work on the task at hand. And so developing strategies and developing skills to look for the data that you want is very important. One of my favorite strategies is actually to just describe whatever it is that I'm looking for, and then put shapefile in the query. And what that does is it usually digs up geodata specifically. So if I wanted to find, information about, like, let's say where all of the Major League Baseball parks are in the United States, where would I get a layer like that? Where would I find that data? Well, the nice thing about appending the shapefile to it is that even though shapefiles really aren't exactly the cutting edge of data formats in GIS, there are a lot better alternatives. Shapefile is like unique to GIS, and so that almost always puts you on the right path. This is an example of what that might look like. So I just did shapefile for baseball, and you can see that right away the top hits that I'm getting are likely to include some layers that I might be interested in. So we've got this one here that's got stadiums, which is exactly what I was maybe looking for. So nice trick. Do your query for whatever your topic is, and then try shapefile. And again, pause the video and try that out. Just do a quick Google search. You don't need to download it, but give it a shot, sort of see what comes up, and you might be surprised at how easy this makes it. Hopefully you're not going to have to scour the internet for every last scrap of data that you want. So chances are that there are some common layers that you're interested in, and there's some good sort of aggregators that have already probably put together most of what you're looking for. So we've mentioned a couple already. So Natural Earth and the U.S. Census, we've both talked about in either previous lectures or previous assignments. I'll mention those a little bit today, and we'll go over them in a little bit more detail in sort of the applied part of the lecture. But really I want to focus on some of these other ones. The National Map, OpenStreetMap, the National Weather Service's GIS portal. NASA has a number of different outlets for their geodata. A lot of the remote sensing products that we're interested in come from NASA, and so they are very good about distributing their data that way. The United Nations Environmental Data Explorer is another really good one if you're looking for international data. So we'll talk about that one. And then CGIAR is an aggregator for a really nice global elevation layer that's relatively polished. So the first of these we've talked about in some detail already. I'm just going to mention it in passing here for completeness. But Natural Earth is a product, a series of products that are developed out of the North America Cartographic Information Society, sort of the preeminent cartographic association in the United States. And what they've done is they've put together a really nice set of layers at 3 different scales that you can download this data at sort of the global scale or the country scale. They've got cultural layers, physical layers, raster layers, vector layers, kind of everything that you might want. So I consider this a really nice one-stop shop for a lot of data that you're working, especially at national to international level. This is where it really is the best. It includes not just the shapes that you might be interested in, but also the attributes as well, which is very handy. The other big one is the National Map. So the National Map is a really spectacular, relatively new effort, kind of spearheaded by the USGS. And it's a way that you can log in and not just browse data that is available, but to download it as well. And what the National Map can do is always increasing. It's always getting better every year. I've got to sort of recalibrate these lectures so that you're seeing exactly what's going on. And we'll show you some of that in the applied part of the lecture again. But you can download lots of things here, everything from hydro layers, elevation, imagery, transportation layers, water bodies, geographic names, land cover, land use. All kinds of things are available through this one portal. So spectacular resource for everything sort of within the United States. This would be my first stop.
So you'll get a chance to see the national map in a sort of an extended treatment and an accompanying lecture. But I wanted to just quickly mention the USGS Earth Explorer, which is the equivalent for global data. So you can see a screenshot of it here. It's got digital elevation, digital maps, orthophotos, radar, quite a few different types of data here. So if there's something that you're looking for that's kind of global, sort of parallel to what you might find on the national map, check out the USGS Earth Explorer.
OpenStreetMap is a sort of like a Wikipedia for geographic data. It's a nice resource that was started about 15 years ago or so. And what it is a bunch of user-contributed information. So it's got street data for sure. A lot of that stuff came originally from sort of census data. But most of it at this point has now been contributed by the user community. So it contains things like sidewalks, building outlines, bike paths. Some students in this class previously have worked on adding things like bus routes to the map. So fantastic resource for sort of oddball things that you're only really going to find things that have been sort of contributed by users. So really nice resource here. We've got a whole lecture coming up on OpenStreetMap. It's new to a lot of people, and so we'll spend a good bit of time on that. So we'll focus less on that both here and in the applied section, knowing that we're going to circle back and get to it again later. This is a kind of a good resource for meteorologists taking the class. So this is the National Weather Service GIS portal. Ton of really good resources here. Fantastic sort of first stop for anything weather related. This is one of my personal favorites. So NASA's Visible Earth Collection. You've probably seen some of these before. This is a satellite composite. So it's not a single image. They sort of take photographs over the Earth's surface at regular intervals every day. Vast tracts of the Earth are getting imaged. And what they try to do is they try to find coverage from at least one day that doesn't have clouds on it to sort of provide an overall view of what the Earth looks like as a whole. Sometimes you'll see this called the blue marble, and we'll look at some examples of that. If you're looking for fairly recent data, MODIS is one of my favorite sources for that. The resolution is a little bit coarse, so they've got it at 250 meters, 500 meters, and 1,000 meters, so 1 kilometer. The nice thing about MODIS data is that it comes in fairly rapidly. They look at the entire surface of the Earth every 1 to 2 days. So that's a lot of data. If you're looking for the most current data and don't really care that maybe it's not necessarily that high resolution, this might be the thing for you. They use it for things like monitoring wildfires, weather patterns at a large scale, things like that. One of my favorites is the NASA Socioeconomic Data and Application Center. So this also comes out of NASA. NASA has been charged with a lot of climate science work. And so one of the things that they've taken into account is that the climate and human culture and human societies are integrally bound together. And so you can't really study the environment without also studying people. And so they've made an attempt to sort of combine and aggregate a lot of the human data in ways that are useful for usually environmental kinds of analysis. This is a really nice product right here. We'll take a look again in the applied portion. But this is a gridded population density layer. So taking the censuses that are sort of internal to each country and aggregating all of those together so that you've got a global data set of population or population density. Really useful for global scale modeling. This one is the United States Interagency Elevation Inventory. This site is still live, but these days it's going to point you back to the national map. At some point, probably some of this will go away. But one of the nice things about this is that sort of the federal government has a lot more jurisdiction over coastal areas than they tend to do in internal areas. And so when a lot of states and counties started to do LiDAR scans, these laser-based scans of elevation to produce really highly detailed maps of elevation that we would call DEMs, or digital elevation models. The earliest sort of to get composited were a lot of the coastal counties. And so the United States Interagency Elevation Inventory was this sort of clearinghouse for a lot of the publicly available LiDAR data that you could get. These days it's actually more than just LiDAR, so we've got things like radar-based imagery and other things as well, bathymetry or underwater elevations. So a lot of really useful stuff comes out of this, but again, most of this is now linked from the national map as well. Another one is the United Nations Environmental Data Explorer. So whenever I'm looking for data about foreign countries that's not available via Natural Earth, The UN Environmental Data Explorer is the first place that I go to. So they've got shapefiles and geodatabases, and actually it's a really nice way to browse through a lot of that data online without ever having to download it. That can really simplify the search process when you get a chance to sort of browse through it online, try it before you buy it, even though obviously it's free. But a lot of really good data here, and not just geodata, but stuff that you might just download in Excel spreadsheets as well. We talked about the U.S. Census in the previous assignment. This is the agency that's charged with sort of keeping track of population in the United States, and that's applies at a lot of different scales. So country level, state, county, tract, and block group boundaries all come within the purview of the U.S. Census. And they're collecting data not just on population, but race, education, gender, all kinds of different variables. So if you want data about people, the U.S. Census is really your best bet. The website is not the most easy to navigate at times, and so there are some groups that have sort of done a really good job of supplementing that and sort of pre-packaging it and processing it for you, and we'll see an example of that too. Finally, I wanted to mention this one. I don't use this one as often anymore, but this is the CGIAR, the Consortium for Spatial Information. This is a group that specializes in sort of, again, providing global scale databases for various purposes. Their big claim to fame is this one, so the SRTM 90-meter digital elevation data set. There are other newer sources for that data these days, but it's a spectacular data set because it's been very carefully managed. So, it's very difficult to get very accurate elevation readings globally, at least comprehensively. If you have things like cloud cover, they can interfere with those measurements. And so the CGIAR processing of the SRTM, which is the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission, is considered some of the best in the world. If you need data finer than 90 meters, then you would probably want to use a different data source like Aster. But because of the quality assurance that comes with SRTM, this is a really good place to go to. Finally, here I wanted to talk about the county health rankings. So county health rankings is going to break down the United States by county, and it's going to have, I forget how many variables it has, but it's on the order of, let's say, 80 different variables, slicing all across not just health-related stuff, but literacy, education, crime, you name it. If you're interested in mapping it, it's probably in that database. So spectacular resource. We'll walk through some of that in the applied section. A lot of maps that you can make sort of on the fly. But if you're interested in downloading it, you can do that too. Finally, I wanted to mention a couple of other outlets. So these are the 6 that I'm going to mention. There are lots and lots of GIS blogs out there. There's a link if you're kind of interested in finding more. So many map nerds love to start blogs. It's hard to beat. So I just wanted to talk about a few of my favorites. So without further ado, let's take a look. So the first is the ArcGIS blog, and there's a good chance that if you're Googling anything to do with Arc, that you're going to wind up here. There's been a really nice series kind of going over the past few years called Ask a Cartographer. That's just exceptionally useful. Talks about the issues involved, sort of how to do it in Arc. Really, really thorough and great resource. Not just, again, for using the tools in Arc, but using them well and using them right, and being able to generate really good maps out of them. So if you have a way to subscribe to blogs, this is a good one. This is a good one to go with. GeoCurrents is one of these things that I sort of have on my Facebook feed. Every once in a while, there'll be a good story that comes up. Map-based, a lot of really spectacular map resources here. A lot of these kinds of things, again, subscribing via Twitter or Facebook or something like that is the way to go. And you can just sort of see these things pop up, one or, every day or every other day or something like that. And it just makes for kind of a nice way to keep in touch with sort of the most current events going on in the GIS world. A lot of really well-written stuff, really, a lot of really good maps. Map Brief is another one sort of in the same vein. Again, I've got it subscribed to on my Facebook feed and just really enjoy the articles as as they come by. 538 is probably my favorite data journalism site. So they do a really good job of presenting stories that are really not just map-based, although they do a really good job with that. But they sort of look at all kinds of different things from culture. Nate Silver, the sort of pollster guru that started it, has a real affinity for sports and applying data science to sports. And so 538 is a really great resource for not just maps, but a lot of other things too. And then probably my favorite one is Mike Bostock. So Mike Bostock is a graduate of MIT and kind of became famous in the last few years for producing some really spectacular visualizations. He works on a thing called D3, which is a JavaScript library that you can tap into for doing some really amazing visualizations on the web. And there's a good chance that if you're looking at a dynamic, interesting visualization on the web, that Mike Bostock had something to do with it. So lots of really, really good examples there. Finally, I wanted to mention one last thing here, and that's a plugin that I use pretty frequently. So this is the Google Earth plugin for Chrome. I've got the URL for it here, but if this URL doesn't work, then just search for Earth View for Google Earth. And it's, like I said, a plugin for Chrome, and I'll show you what this one does. So once you load Google up and you load a new tab, its job is to open a really interesting, unique place. So I'll just install this. It only takes a second. So we go to the web store. We can add it to Chrome. And then, so it's just that easy. And then everything that you want to do after that, all you do is you open a new tab, and it's going to fetch these new kind of amazing, spectacular images as you go along. This every time you open a new tab, it's going to take you to some interesting new place on the Earth. Really beautiful, spectacular images, and one of my favorite plugins ever. You can see where these things are at the bottom. So this is in the United Arab Emirates. If you click on the globe down there, it'll take you to a Google Map view of it, so you can really kind of get your bearings and take a look at it. So that's spectacular. And then you can also get the link to the permanent link for this if you ever wanted to share it with somebody, so that if you wanted to bring it in here, somebody can go to the exact same site. So with that, we'll end the lecture today. We're going to go through a few of these data sources in the applied section of lecture. So we'll see you next time. Thanks.